Next up on the broadcast, Alabama Democratic Party Chairwoman Nancy Worley is back in studio with us. Ms. Worley, welcome back to Capitol Journal.
Thank you, Don.
Always a pleasure to see you.
It's always great to be with you.
Ms. Worley, the Democratic National Committee this week set a new deadline. I think it's August 17th for the state party to hold a new election for your office. You've already missed one deadline, have you not, in holding that election? Let's start there, about missing that deadline.
Well, actually, this started last August,
Sure.
almost a year ago, when we had the election at which time I was reelected.
Right.
And of course, some people didn't agree with that election, and 9 of them filed a challenge with the Democratic National Committee. At that time, we had a hearing before the Credentials Committee, and the Credentials Committee set a deadline in the spring. So we assumed that we were going to have everything completed in the spring. We set up a timeline. We actually got a venue to have the meeting. And then their timeline didn't work out because they wanted to have bylaw changes for the party. And so we're still working on those bylaw changes as late as this week. And now, after those bylaw changes were not made, then they said, well, we'll have to change that date. So we really didn't miss the date. We had the date reserved at a location, and because we had not agreed upon bylaw changes, then obviously the date for the election was changed. Now what we are now doing is negotiating those bylaws. If we can all come to agreement, then we will meet on I think they said either August 10th or August 17th, and have a vote on the bylaws and then a vote for the chair and the vice chair.
Now, the bylaws changes that the DNC has requested of the state party, let's talk about those for a moment. I think they've proposed, among other things, more transparency with the party's minority caucus, the Alabama Democratic Conference, appointing minority members to the State Democratic Executive Committee. And they also want more inclusion, more diversity on that board. They want more Hispanics, Asians, disabled, LGBTQ membership on that board, right?
Right. What the Credentials Committee ruled back last winter is that we should have an affirmative action plan, a very aggressive affirmative action plan, to include other groups. As you well know, the largest voting bloc within the Democratic Party are black. And so that voting bloc comprises somewhere between 60 to 70% in most presidential or gubernatorial elections. So as a result of that representation is reflected on the State Democratic Executive Committee. If that number of blacks are not elected, then they are elected by the minority caucus, and that caucus elects the number required to meet that percentage, which is exactly the way the Democratic National Committee handles it. Our bylaws say that we base our representation of ethnic minorities either on their number in the population or their percentage in the Democratic electorate. With blacks, it's certainly a higher percentage in the Democratic electorate than in the population. Now, with Hispanics, it's probably going to be more in the population than in the Democratic electorate, because Hispanics are probably voting about 50-50 Democrats and Republicans. So you have to take all of those numbers and figure them out when you're looking at the composition of the committee. What we did work on for several weeks was a very aggressive affirmative action plan to include more ethnic minorities in the party. I'm very proud of the fact that we actually last year, when we elected a new State Democratic Executive Committee, we elected one Asian, and that's our first ever Asian to be elected. We elected at least 2 Native Americans. We're not sure, there may be more, but we know of 2 who have tribal cards and numbers. We elected, I think it's either 7 or 8 who are self-acknowledging LGBTQ members, and that we've never really counted those numbers before, but we know from their writing it on a form, a profile form, that many were elected. We know that we elected 2 Hispanics, And I think that's the area where we need to elect some more.
You mentioned you're negotiating with the DNC over these bylaws changes. Are you optimistic you'll reach an agreement?
Well, we've come a long way, as the saying is. We started out with our bylaws being what we've had for many, many years. They are based on what we've done forever in the party. I think we had made some outreach efforts. As I said, last year we elected a much more diverse group of people on the SDEC than we had ever elected before. But that doesn't mean we can't do more. Each year in our delegate selection plan, we have, each 4 years when we select delegates for the National Convention, we have an affirmative action section of that where we have to do research on ethnic groups and other groups that are underrepresented and literally determine what our goals will be for delegates. Now, sometimes we reach those goals, sometimes we do not. But now it's going to be in our bylaws that we are going to do outreach to try to meet a more diverse population. And I'm very optimistic that we have been doing that outreach, but I think we're going to do more of it now.
Very briefly, what about the transparency issue where the minority caucus's appointments to the Democratic Executive Committee are concerned?
Well, there's really a lot of confusion about that, so I'm really glad you asked that question. The ADC is not the minority caucus. The ADC is an organization that stands on its own set of bylaws, and it has its own structure and its own chair and officers, and has a group with every county in the state. Now, prior to each SDEC meeting, there is a minority caucus meeting, which is traditionally the Black Caucus in Alabama. What we're proposing in these new bylaws is that there would be a diversity caucus that would include all of these other represented ethnic minority groups as well as underrepresented groups. It could be labor. It could be, as I said earlier, veterans. Any group that's not represented well in the party, we're reaching out to that group. And the minority caucus meets an hour before the SDEC meeting. And for example, on those at-large members that people say, oh, Joe Reed's adding on at-large members.
Joe Reed, of course, the chair of the ADC.
Joe Reed's the chair of the ADC, but he was also elected as the chair of the minority caucus. And that's one reason there's some confusion. People assume the ADC is the minority caucus, but the minority caucus is really all the blacks who were elected to the SDEC, and those are not all members of the Alabama Democratic Conference.
Thanks for setting the record straight.
Because some of those are members of New South. Some of them are not members of any particular group. They just happen to be African American or black. And so 1 hour before the SDEC meets, the minority caucus meets. People nominate folks to hold the at-large positions. They vote on a slate that they bring to the SDEC for the at-large positions. Now, if the bylaws go through, as we assume they will, the diversity caucus will do the same for other groups. So there will be the minority caucus, which will be the blacks. There will be a diversity caucus, which will represent Asians and Hispanics and Native Americans and LGBTQ and veterans and whatever. And that caucus will be electing representatives from those groups. So assuming that all these little pieces fall into place, then we'll have our election of officers.
There's a lot at stake. I believe the DNC has said that if you don't comply to their satisfaction, your party credentials could be in jeopardy.
Well, and we've asked them a question about if you don't credential someone, what do you lose? I mean, in this case, Randy and I are the two, by virtue of our offices, as every other chair and vice chair in the country, by virtue of holding those offices, we hold 2 seats on the Democratic National Committee. That's a huge group of hundreds of people. We're not sure just losing a vote on that committee would be what decredentialing someone would involve. So they have yet to give us an answer as to, if we lose our credentials, what have we lost?
You mentioned that this all began last August when you were reelected to another term as chair of the state Democratic Party. Your election was challenged. There were accusations that the deck was stacked in your favor by the ADC, by the Democratic Executive Committee. Some of the questions which are at the heart now of the DNC's concerns moving forward. You've also said that you are optimistic that despite the challenge that you will win this new election. You remain optimistic?
I do remain optimistic. I think we've done some good things in the 5 years that I've served as chair. I know there are those who would disagree, and but I personally see where we were and where we've moved, and I think that's forward progress, and we need to make more of that. Paying down the debt has been a monumental accomplishment. You know, in terms of reaching out and having a better infrastructure, we have that now. We don't have a perfect one, but we have a better one. And so as a result of all of that, I think we've made some moves in the right direction. I'm optimistic. I think it is most unfortunate that, you know, people who lose sometimes can't accept loss. And so we've had to work on this for a year and really lose some time. I oftentimes wonder if maybe the Republicans are paying these folks to challenge us because, you know, the Republicans obviously want us to sit around and spin our wheels on things like this as opposed to getting out there working to get Democrats elected. And so, you know, I'm not saying that they sit in a room and contemplate those things, but it is unfortunate that we've had to spend a full year almost working on what should have been settled last August.
We only have a couple more minutes, but I want to touch on several things. One, you faced opposition last year from a candidate who was supported by probably the most influential Democratic elected official in this state. That's U.S. Senator Doug Jones. He supported Peck Fox, who challenged you a year ago. This time you have two opponents who are challenging you for the position. Do you find that daunting, that the state's most influential Democratic office holder opposed you last year?
No, Doug wanted to be chair at one time. Several years ago, he ran for chair. He was beaten for chair, and I don't think he's ever gotten over that, as a matter of fact. You know, if I had a piece of advice to give him, I would tell him to concentrate on his own race. He has, you know, a race to run of his own. We wish him well.
Finally, let's turn to the national front for a moment. The headlines have been full this week of President Trump telling 4 liberal Democratic congresswomen that if they didn't like this country, they could, quote, go back where they came from. There have been contentions that comment was racist. The U.S. House, matter of fact, passed a resolution criticizing the president over doing that. He has said he is not a racist. In the meantime, pundits have said that President Trump may be baiting Democrats in this respect to put the attention all on these 4 Democratic congresswomen who are called the Squad, and using that to propel himself to re-election victory next year. What do you say to that?
Well, Don, you know, he's very strong in the South. You know, they like, Southerners like big talkers, little doers. And that's a quote from Benjamin Franklin. And Trump's good at talking. I don't think he's been a particularly good president at all, but he's good at talking. And he can go out and say outrageous things, and it captures the attention of a lot of Southerners and others in the country, not just in the South. But I think when he says things to these 4 women, all of who have been elected by their constituents to Congress, and he tells them if they don't like something, just go home. Well, their home is here. Their home is right here in the country. You know, maybe their families immigrated here, but we're all the products of immigrants. I mean, every single one of us, unless you can trace your lines back to some very long ago Native Americans, we're all immigrants. So if you start telling everybody in America to go home, then you'll clean out the country because there won't be many Native Americans. It'll be an empty country. I think it was wrong for him to say that to women who were elected by their constituents. He probably wouldn't have said that to 4 men. And that's just interesting that people will say things to females who are elected that they won't say to males. And I do think it's deplorable of the president to criticize 4 women who were elected by their constituents. You may not agree with them. You may not like how they dress. You may not like what they say. But you should respect their office. And as much as I don't like the President of the United States, I respect that office.
Finally, do you think his doing what he did accomplished exactly what some of the pundits contend he accomplished? That was putting the focus on these polarizing congresswomen, if you will. They've been characterized as such, among others, and benefiting politically in the process.
Oh, there's no doubt. He benefits when he race baits, and he's racist. But there are a lot of folks right here in Alabama who are racist. I guess we all are to a little extent because we see things from our perspective. Whatever race we are, we see it from our perspective. But in his case, I think he does it knowingly because he simply gathers more support in the South and Rust Belt areas and other parts of the country. I think it's economic in many cases where they say, oh, those immigrants are coming in and getting my job. And they base it on their pocketbooks, but they really just don't like someone who looks differently from them. And I think it's most unfortunate that the President of the United States would stoop to those kinds of tactics, but it works for him in the South. He's obviously trying to shore up his base here.
President Trump, of course, said this week that he does not have a racist bone in his body. What do you say to that?
Well, there's a saying that goes, liar, liar, pants on fire, right? I'm not calling the president a liar because obviously then I'd be doing what he's doing. But I don't think that anyone can, with a lot of reasoning, can look at what the president said and did and not think that it was racially motivated. It's just sad that we refight the Civil War on a daily basis. Here in Alabama, we refight it. Even within our party, we refight it. We do so in government. We do so in education. We do so in churches, the most segregated hour on Sunday morning. We tend to fight still on the basis of race, and that tends to be an issue that you can get people to agree and rally around. And so I think he did it purposefully.
Alabama Democratic Party Chair Nancy Worley, always a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you, Don.
Thank you for being here today.
Thank you.